Until I showed up is that I'm actually a Hoosier. I was born in Bloomington in 1946, and to be asked to come back to Indiana is like thanks from me to you, because I have a lot of memories. So, where to start? I can start by thanking some very important people. Beth Turcott, who was just talking, Kathy Hardwick, Bill, Ruth, and Ray Wakeland, who are good friends, and last but not least, James Miley. You're going to say, who is James Miley? Does anybody here know who, besides Beth, who knows who James Miley is? When you're a guy between the age of 9 and 10 years old, I learned a couple weeks ago while I was on the beach at Dewey Beach where we were. That's why we got kind of tan. Somebody was explaining to me that it was very important for a young kid, a boy kind of kid like I was, between the ages of 9 and 10, very important for him to have some feeling of worth. The field isn't necessarily important, but it's really important to have a feeling that you are going to be happy and do something. And between the ages of 9 and 10, I got involved in something called the Soapbox Derby. And I was such a brat, such an hyperactive nut as a kid that I actually was able to badger my parents. It ended up being my mother. After I raced in the Soapbox Derby in 1958, I actually badgered her to drive me to Akron, Ohio and watch the International Soapbox Derby at Akron, Ohio. And we were 50 feet from the finish line taking pictures like nobody's business. And who won in 1958? From Muncie, Indiana, James Miley. He was my role model when I was about 10, 11, 12 years old. And I remember when I came down the hill, he was real tall and he had to bend real double and he had this beautiful car, and I just the whole thing was just my heart. And I remember the announcer said, "Here comes James Miley from Muncie, Indiana, so tall that he has to bend double and rest his chin in his kneecaps as he drives his car." I wonder how many thousand kids went home like I did, closed the door in the room and practiced bending down and putting their chin in their kneecaps for 10 minutes at a time. I did that for a couple of years, just to see if I could ever be James Miley from Muncie, Indiana. So I'd never been to Muncie before yesterday. And to drive into Muncie for me was like, I don't know who James Miley is now. I don't know where he is. There's one in the phone book. I called him today and got an answering machine and said, nah, I can't deal with that. But that was an important person in my life when I was 12. 11, 12. The Northern Kentucky Brotherhood, a black gospel group of singers from, we're not sure exactly where in Kentucky, but they're fantastic singers. I understand they've been here before. My wife and I, heard them at a festival called Augusta a few years ago, and the Wakelands also heard them at Augusta, and they're just incredible singers. They sing without any accompaniment. They're really nice people. And there's something really funny about the bass singer, because he's smaller than I am, and he can sing about an octave lower than I can, and every time I'm around him I try and sing lower, and then nobody can sing as low as he does. It's just really amazing. They're going to be doing a free concert, 7 to 8 p.m. at Emmons Auditorium this coming Thursday, September 21st. They're having a Meet the Kentucky Brotherhood Singers supper at the Hazelwood Christian Church at 5:15. Tomorrow is your last day to buy tickets. If you're a student, the tickets are $4, and if you're a post-student, tickets are $6. Tomorrow is your last day to get tickets. If you have not heard the Northern Kentucky Brotherhood and you want to meet some really nice guys who can really sing, give yourself a treat. It's free. When I was born in 1946, television had not come to Bloomington. So I grew up in an era before television. That doesn't seem possible, but there was a time before computers and even television. My parents decided they'd build a house out in the country. And so they found a little dirt road called Sayre Road, and they started building a house. And I have a vague recollection of a lot of this stuff. I mean, it's sort of hazy in my head. And after I'd been married for 5 years, my wife made the observation that there was a a person inside that of my wife. There's a little girl who I'd never met, and she wrote out her childhood memories of a girl who grew up in Washington, D.C., and I had never met this person because I married her when she was an older person. And this is all about the young girl who grew up in Washington, D.C., and I thought, you know, I can't remember anything about my childhood, but I grew up in the country, and it was pretty nice. It was pretty fun because there weren't any nasty people out there, and people weren't, you know, killing each other. You could go for a walk for miles and hours at a time as a 10-year-old kid, and you were very safe around Bloomington at that time. So about 5 years later, I finally decided that it was time to write out my childhood memories. And so I wrote out all my childhood memories, or a lot of them, and it ended up being 80 pages of growing up in the country outside of Bloomington. And things I remembered were unique to me. The reason I'm bringing this up is my little soapbox talk about writing your childhood memories. Every one of you who is over the age of 30, there's a little kid that unless you write it out, that kid is gone. And it's good for your spouse to learn about the person they never met. But it's good to get that kid out again, too. And there's a really neat kid inside of every adult that you don't have to write the junky stuff. I skipped the junky stuff. But the fun stuff is really amazing. Somebody told me once that children are the world's best observers, but the world's worst interpreters. And as I'm writing out all this stuff's coming back. Like my parents, I was hyperactive. They'd open the door, we had 7 acres and big farms all around us. I'd just leave in the morning, come back at supper time. My parents would say, "What'd you do?" And I said, "Oh, nothing." You know, I didn't tell them about what I did because they wouldn't believe me anyway. So I had a chance to write it all out. And I sent it to them for proofreading, and they just, you know, didn't even answer. They just didn't have a clue. Who was this? And, I mean, my neighbor and I went down and dug a room in what we call the lowlands, the pasture below. I lived on a ridge. We were ridge kids. You had ridge kids, you had valley kids. I grew up on the south side of Bloomington, and the glacier stopped on the north side. So down where I grew up, it was hills and valleys. The school buses went on either through the valleys or on the ridges. And I was a ridge kid. I went to a ridge school called Phillips School on Knight Ridge Road, the corner of Knight Ridge and Lampkins Ridge. And we did things like down the valleys. We dug a hole. We dug a big hole, my neighbor and I. It could have caved in and killed us both, and nobody ever, they'd still be looking for us now. I mean, we had a room down there that was our little private room. We used to go down there. It smelled kind of bad, so we finally just put a big rock over it and forgot about it. But if my parents had ever found out about that one, I'd have been hung. And I used to walk down, we had limestone creeks, and the Kentucky coal miners during the Depression couldn't make it in Kentucky, so they came up to southern Indiana to work in the stone quarries. And they'd do the same thing in southern Indiana they did in Kentucky. They'd drive down a dirt road and they'd see a nice flat creek bed, and they'd just take their car and go down to the creek bed and then go up the creek bed, and as soon as they saw a little draw between two hills, they'd just go there and start building a little shack. And so when I was a kid, I liked to walk down these creek beds looking for turtles and snakes, and I'd say, "Oh, there's some tire tracks. Where do they go?" There were so few people out there that I was always curious. As a kid, I'd just go right up to their shack and knock on the door and say, "Hi, where are you from?" You know. And I was maybe 10 or 11 years old, and my parents never knew that. So we won't tell. But I met all these really great people because they had lots of stories. And one of my favorite people was a lady named Granny Hughes, and she lived down this little creek that went down through the valleys, and you ended up at Granny Hughes' little shack. And Granny Hughes was a faith healer, and she was determined that I was going to learn how to be a faith healer. And she'd go out and get willow branches and have me hold them and see if I could feel it. You know, the water, and I never could feel the water. And she was really disappointed in that. And she tried to get me to learn how to walk 30 steps down a creek going such and such a direction and throw salt over my shoulder, and this is good for that, and this is good for that. And I just wanted to hear her play the banjo, because she had a banjo in her little shack, and she used to play these tunes. And this is an old banjo. First tunes I heard from her, and it's called Sick Pad, Come and Get Your Nubbin, which meant, come here, piebald horse, eat your nubbin of corn, I'll give you another one. But in Kentucky talk, it was Sick Pad, Come and Get Your Nubbin. time I tap my foot, spaceships land. Sick pad, come get your nubbin. Sick pad, come get your nubbin. Sick pad, come and get your nubbin. Eat all up and come get another. Not real fancy, but it was neat. So she introduced me to some of her neighbors, one of whom was a guy who had perfect recall. And Mr. Perfect Recall had perfect recall. You could say September the 3rd, 1935, and he'd tell you what he wore, what he had for breakfast, and what happened to that day. And then people came from all over southern Indiana to talk to Mr. Bud Pennington. And he had the shaky hands. He said, that was my mark. I have shaky hands because I have a perfect memory of every minute of every day. Anything that's ever passed through my ears or in front of my eyes, I remember. And we used to ask him questions about how much such and such cost in 1927. It was all in his head. You know, what time did the sun come up? Oh, what was your mother wearing that day? He knew it all. It was all in his head. Interesting for a kid 10 years old to meet somebody like that who had perfect recall, because I just always studied him a lot when I went to visit him. And he said, well, I got a neighbor who plays the dulcimer. We went over to Mr. Campbell. He had a 3-string dulcimer. He played it with a fiddle bow in one hand. He played it with a fiddle bow in one hand while he did the fretting with the other hand. I never saw anybody else in southern Indiana playing a dulcimer with a fiddle bow. That was kind of unusual. And we met lots of people. A lot of Kentucky people didn't live real fancy. I had a friend named Slim Mosier who slept in his car. That's where he lived. And people kind of steered clear of him because he was weird. But of course, me being a tenacious little banjo nut, I'd go up and ask him if he could play me a banjo tune, and I'd take he had a banjo, and so he'd play me tunes like, eat the corn, chew the cow, eat the corn, chew the cow, just like a mother hog, eat the corn, chew the cow, just like a mother hog, eat the corn, chew the cow, just like a mother hoggy, I'll kiss you in the morning soon. Same tune. I said, wait a minute, that's the same tune Granny Hughes plays. And he said, that's my aunt. A lot of funny stuff going on down there. I know it's always fun to ask. Here's one of my great. How many of you had a family whistle? Come on. Do you remember your family whistle? What was your family whistle? Better stay in practice. Nice. Who else had a family whistle? Ours was. That's real handy when you got a whole bunch of kids down the creek playing together and one parent wants their kids back home. When you heard that whistle, you knew exactly who was supposed to go where then. And every once in a while you hear somebody in a store or something give a family whistle, and I always, it just takes me back to my childhood, but people just don't seem to use family whistles anymore. When you're shopping in a big shopping center, it's nice to have a family whistle. I'm getting feedback up here. Did you know that? Face that toward my mouth. Like that? Okay. Family whistles are fun. We also had a 7-party telephone, and you know, I won't admit that I listened much on the telephone, but it was kind of fun because there was nobody else out there. We had, I think we were 2 longs and a short was our ring, and it was interesting. You know, you hear all these different rings all day long, and you wonder, what are they talking about? Because our nearest neighbor was about a half a mile away, and the rest of the people on the party line, you never knew who they were. They were way off in somewhere, and you always wondered, who could those rings be for? As a kid, you'd pick up the phone and say, yeah. So let's see. Any of you from Bloomington? Somebody's from Bloomington. You're kids. It's not a town anymore. It's Bloomington, the metropolis. When I was there, it was like 7,000 people. People drove cars through Bloomington on their rims. They didn't have tires on their cars. They just went through on the rims. People rode their bicycles with no tires on the bicycle rims. I mean, they had the stopping contest on South Walnut Street, and it was hysterical because they said, if anybody can go 25 miles an hour and stop a car in 50 feet, we'll give them $100. And people just left their transmissions on South Walnut Street trying to stop those cars. And that turned out to be the social bonding event of Bloomington in my whole childhood, is watching these guys roll up their sleeves, put their cigarettes in their arms, in their sleeve, and get in their car and go 25 miles an hour and hit the brakes and throw it in reverse, and parts would go flying everywhere, and they go 52 feet. They demolished their car and they didn't get the money, and it was great. Great memories of Bloomington. So Phillips School is a great school. Kids from Kentucky. I went to school with kids from Kentucky. Their parents brought up all these wonderful tunes and songs, and I got to play out in the playground at recess time, and all these fun songs were out there. Then you go down to downtown Bloomington, and when I was a kid, in the early 50s, there was a couple named McDaniel, and they used to be outside the 5 and 10 store. Bloomington still, I understand, just barely has a wonderful square still there and a wonderful courthouse. And when I was a kid, they used to sit there and trade pocket knives. The old guys would be out there trading pocket knives, and every once in a while somebody had a fiddle or banjo, and they'd do banjo stuff. And a guy named John Kinney used to play Molly and Tinbrooks on the banjo and make a lot of noise, especially during the 4th of July. They'd have all the fathers of the town would have a bandstand at one end, and then there'd be this bozo at the other end throwing his banjo around, yelling and whooping, and of course making such a scene. Nobody wanted to listen to the organized music on the big wagon they had there for the fathers of the town. They'd all go over there and watch John Kinney sing Molly and Tinbrook and be throwing the banjo around and making a big scene. I was one of those people who went over to watch the banjo. So the McDaniels played right in front of the 5 and 10, and they had a wooden mandolin. I know he's going crazy every time I touch this. They had a wooden mandolin that Mr. McDaniels had made for his wife. It was strung like a mandolin, and he had a fiddle that was made out of a wooden cigar box. So they had these 2 cigar box instruments, and they used to play tunes. And this is really where I got a good, solid knowledge of old-time tunes like this one. They used to play Golden Slippers and Red Wing, and here's just a nice, simple, fretless. This is a smooth fingerboard banjo. This is just Red Wing, a nice, simple version. Nope, that's Buffalo Gals. Got the wrong tune. The banjos you found in Bloomington when I was a kid were junk. No offense to Sears, but they were junk. All you could do is go to Roan's music store and buy a banjo in the mail or make it yourself. Good instruments never got to Bloomington in the 50s, 40s, 30s. It took too much money, and there were no stores that carried them, so you had to get it from Sears, and Sears just wasn't the best. They're good for houses. I live in a 1912 Sears house. They're good at houses, but banjo's not too good. So a lot of the banjos I was around were homemade banjos. Banjo was always sort of something I loved to listen to, but I never thought I'd ever play one. That wasn't one of the things because my parents said, you're going to be a trombone player. So I had years of trombone lessons, and then I tried the bassoon, and I tried other instruments, but it didn't work because I wanted to play the melody. And I just couldn't get anything that was easy on the guitar or the mandolin or the fiddle or it was the banjo. And it took a long time for me to find that. In the interim, while I was out looking for interesting people who played this kind of music, I used to do a lot of bicycle riding in southern Indiana. And one day, these 2 college guys named Jerry Swisher and David Blaze came riding out from Indiana University, and they took me under their wing. I was a little 12-year-old kid, and they said, if you want to ride with us on Wednesdays and Saturdays, we go for rides out in the country. And our goal is to get the farm dogs excited and get them to chase us. And then we get this big adrenaline rush, and we go like crazy, and we build big muscles in our legs for the little 500. And that was really fun. We'd go out and tantalize dogs, you know, and the dogs would come out by the pack, and we'd just take off down through the hills, and we'd go for 20-mile rides. And it's just wonderful memories for a 12, 13, 14-year-old kid. And we moved when I was 14, and years later I'm in a, you know, I'd gone to see Breaking Away, the movie Breaking Away, and I'm sitting there reading a magazine about breaking away and how the whole thing was modeled after some bicycle rider about the little 500 whose name was David Blaze. And I said, no wonder that movie seemed awfully close to my home. You know, that was the guy I used to ride bicycles with when I was a kid, David Blaze and Jerry Swisher. Two really nice guys. I was a lucky kid. I was a really lucky kid because I just bumped into these people. Just notes I want to pass on. One of the wonderful places that our school bus used to stop was called Jones's Trading Post out on Night Ridge Road. And Mr. Jones had a banjo, fiddle, and a guitar around a wood-burning stove. And in that area of Indiana, it got so cold in the wintertime, people actually froze to death further out the area, the ridges and the valleys where I lived. So they'd come in and barter their way through the winter, and they just run up a bill at Jones's. And Jones's Trading Post was the last of a, there is no other place like that left, I'm sure. Jones used to refer to everybody who came through the door as honey. And so everybody came in, he'd say, hey, honey, to anybody. You ever hear Jones's Trading Post? You Bloomington people? No, it's gone. Everybody came. Everybody was honey. So the big sign outside just said, Honey Jones's Trading Post. And he got to be known as Honey Jones. So Honey Jones was the drawing card for lots of people in the wintertime, and I had a chance to listen to fiddle and banjo players, and that's where I met lots of these guys who I heard play the banjo and were a big influence on me. Matt Walker was one of those guys. Matt Walker was a cross-eyed banjo player. You never knew which eye, as a kid, where was I supposed to be looking, you know, because you just, there was no book, you know, you just didn't know. And he played all these wonderful tunes, but he had a really heavy Kentucky accent, and I couldn't understand a lot of the stuff he sang. Let's see. I guess I'll play a couple more on this. This is G tuning. How many of you out there are banjo people? How many of you play the banjo? There's one hand, two hands. Come on. I know you play banjo. There's another banjo player. You play this style, this funny style, or you play bluegrass?
I'm trying to play bluegrass. I used to play tenor when I was a kid.
That doesn't help you a whole lot in bluegrass, does it?
That doesn't.
It's a mess. How about you? Clawhammer. Uh-oh. From around here? Do we know each other? No, we don't know each other. Okay. So, uh-oh, I got some interesting people over here. I mean, you know, for me. The banjo has many different tunings. When I left Bloomington, I basically only knew G tuning, and I had a zillion tunes in my head, but I couldn't figure out how to play them. And one day, somebody said, well, you tune this one up a little. And that takes you out of a G chord into what's called a G modal. It's out of a full chord, but it gives you a wonderful, strange sound. And I fooled around with that, and I realized, gee, some of these tunes that I had in my head from playing at Phillips School, the school I went to, they fit in this tuning. One of the tunes I'll tell you about is called Charlie's Knee. I learned it as a tune about a guy's knee. I never understood it. Why would they make a tune about a guy's knee? But in Monroe County, they called it Charlie's Knee. So that was it. Do you know that one? And so I worked it out on banjo because nobody else, I guess Peter Hoover, one of the great banjo players who came through Bloomington, had played it for me one time, but he was so good, he was so much better than I was that I didn't get much out of that except a whole lot of notes. And so I figured out Charlie's Knee, and I moved basically to Washington, D.C. about 1965 for the first time. And I played it for some of the people who knew folk music, and they said, no, it's not about his knee. It's about Prince Charles of England. Charlie's neat. and Charlie's sweet, and Charlie, he's a dandy. I said, oh, I liked it better as a knee. So this is a wonderful tune called Charlie's Neat, or Charlie's Knee. Charlie's neat, Charlie's sweet, Charlie he's a dandy. Charlie he's the very man that feeds the girls on candy. So eventually I got a banjo with frets. Here's a banjo with frets. Tuning the banjo is always the biggest problem because every time you tune something up here, something else moves down here, and they're just really fussy. Stephen Wade calls them the musical mule, because when you're ready to go, they're not. That's one. So I'm in G. Oh, so many stories to tell you. You want to hear tunes? I put out a CD 3 years ago of old-time banjo tunes. There's 37 tunes on there and 16 pages of BS and pictures of some of the people I knew when I was a kid. And if you want to buy one, they're there. See my beautiful wife. I left her in charge of money. I'm just a banjo player. So many tunes. What are we going to play that's nice and simple? We'll play a finger-picking tune. Here's a nice finger-picking tune from Hagerstown, Maryland. A friend of mine named Peter Hoover, a great banjo player who now plays button accordion and doesn't play banjo much anymore at all, was driving his car through Hagerstown, and he stopped at the gas station, and the guy there said, "Is that a banjo in your back seat?" And Peter said, "Yeah." And he said, "I used to play banjo." And so Peter got his banjo out. And whenever somebody says, "I used to play banjo," those are the guys. Don't turn your back, because those guys are going to do something that's going to just amaze you. And this guy started playing this beautiful tune, which he called Marching Jaybird, using 2 fingers and a thumb. There's so many wonderful tunes. Peter Hoover was a great person who came to Bloomington. Everybody had been playing what they call basic clawhammer style, which is just a basic rhythm like this. Don't leave, I'll stop. A guy with a sense of music. basic right hand is basically this loping. It's 4 notes, but the second one is a rest. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. That's the way everybody played in Bloomington. If they either played finger picking, some pre-Scruggs rolly, not a very good rolly style of banjo playing with either index and thumb or 2 fingers and a thumb, or they played what they called Kentucky style, which was this hitting down style. Come on, microphone, don't do that anymore. I don't mean to be a bass drum up here. I'll just keep on moving the microphone around until it works. Can you still hear it? Whatever. Okay. I have to tap my foot, otherwise I can't talk. Oh boy! Cool! I can make all kinds of noise. That's the way to do it. That is the way to do it. Yeah, you bet. Now I can really play. So, Peter Hoover came to town, and he had picked up the ability and the knowledge of how to play the second. You have 4 notes, 1, 2, 3, 4. You can actually play the second note by dropping your thumb off the 5th string down to the 2nd string. And they call that double note, drop thumb, claw hammer, you know, really fancy names for it. But basically all it is you're adding 1 note to a 4-beat measure. That was just a rest before. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So I can alternate my right hand by going 1, 3, 4, 1, 3, 4, 1, 3, 4. Or I can play 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So you can alternate it and make tunes much more interesting. And this guy came through Bloomington after he left. The world had changed in southern Indiana. Everybody said, "Did you see that guy play banjo? He was good." And some of the tunes he played were so beautiful. Here's one that's called June Apple. It's just a funny tune from Southern Virginia. It's a dance tune. It has lots of rhythm, but it also has just beautiful flow. So I said to Peter Hoover, "Where did you ever learn such a beautiful tune?" You know, when you're 17, 18 years old and you get hit by a truck, like Peter Hoover coming to town playing this beautiful banjo stuff, it was just overwhelming to me as a young guy living in Bloomington. And he said, "Well, there's this guy named Wade Ward who lived in Southern Virginia, a town called Galax, and Independence, Virginia. And he played all these tunes, and he said, I know lots of tunes from this guy, Wade Ward, because I went to his house to visit him. And so I said, someday, I got to go visit Wade Ward. And so I did. And I had a chance to play music with him in parking lots at different festivals and just be around him a lot. And he just played all these wonderful tunes. Here's another one from Wade Ward, a beautiful tune called Chilly Winds. Same guy, called Blackberry Blossom. That's a fun one. It's worth the effort. I'll talk to you later. I'm a banjo nut. 14, I'd never seen, except for Peter Hoover's banjo, I'd never seen a quality banjo. And we moved to Baltimore County. The big old families and the big old houses in Baltimore, Washington, Hartford, Connecticut, Boston, Massachusetts, Chicago, Indianapolis, these people throw out instruments that never made it to Bloomington. Money couldn't buy them. So when I was in high school, I'd go walking back and forth to my school, and I'd find banjos and guitars and mandolins sticking out of trash cans that I would have died for when I was 15 years old. I mean, you know, when I just couldn't believe that people just throw this stuff out. So I started teaching myself how to fix them up. And this one was a $25 banjo in 1964. I bought this from a guy named Jack White, who told me, he said, all the chrome's worn off, is yellow, it's all brass. I said, that looks like gold. He says, 25 bucks, if you want it, that's it. So I said, okay, I'll buy it. I've been playing it since 1971. Took a couple of years to get it set up, but it's a gold-plated banjo that I bought for 25 bucks because the guy just didn't know what he had. People and tunes. When we moved to Baltimore County, can I tell how I guess I'm going to go ahead and tell this story. People say, how did you know, what point was the point that you knew that playing the trombone was not your thing in life and you had to find some other kind of instrument that was more your thing? And when I was in the 10th grade, I walked in the boys' restroom, and a friend of mine who was on the gymnastics team named Wilbur Miller was doing a handstand over the urinal playing the harmonica in his mouth, and that's the moment I knew there was some sort of music out there for me. I knew that there was some sort of unstructured music. You couldn't do that with a trombone or the fiddle. There was some instrument out there that I had to learn to play and play those tunes. If this idiot can do this in the boys' restroom, get a tune out of the boys' restroom doing a handstand, I've got to find some way to play the melody. And so I said to Wilbur when he was done, you know, and I said, hey Wilbur, and I said, where you live? And he said, right over the hill from you. And I said, cool. I said, I want to find some instrument I can play. And he said, well, one of my neighbors has an old banjo in the garage with a 1929 MG boat-tail car. And I said, I like old cars too. So we went over to look at the car, and I ended up with a banjo. And that was the beginning of it. And I started looking for guys near in Maryland who played music. And a lot of them had been Southern Virginia people who moved up to work in the Baltimore area. And I met one guy named Schaff Walcott. He was a stitch. Schaff had a banjo, and the neck was real short. He had just taken a regular saw and cut out about 3 frets worth of neck and then glued it back together. And I wasn't real bright, but I knew that there was something fishy about this way of shortening a banjo neck because, see, you're supposed to be able to count down 12 frets, and that's your halfway point. That's where you get a harmonic. And if you push that down, you should get the same note. Well, if you shorten the banjo neck 3 frets, it's not going to play very nice. And I said to him, could I hear you play the banjo? I'd like to hear a tune on your banjo. He said, I only play when I'm drunk. And I said, I don't drink, and I'm not going to be around here when you're drunk. You just play a tune. He said, I can't, I'm not drunk. And so I never heard Charles Walcott ever play his banjo, but I always wondered what it sounded like. And there was a guy named Mr. MacArthur who lived in a little cabin, and Mr. MacArthur lived right on a creek, and the creek flooded a lot. And he said, I used to play, he was a really gentle guy who I really loved very much when I was growing up, because I could stop by there and it's a little teeny, I mean, he had like a bed in there and there's room for two of us and his dog and a little stove, and that was it. And he said, I used to play the fiddle and the banjo. And he said, but I don't have a fiddle, I don't have a banjo. Well, I found some in the trash and fixed them up and took them down there and gave him a fiddle and gave him a banjo. And we used to sit around, and he said, when I was a kid, they used to play, tunes go in pairs. There's John Henry and John Hardy and Cackling Hen and Cluck Old Hen. And he said, I used to like to play the Cluck Old Hen and the Cackling Hen. Those are my two favorite tunes. And he worked on the fiddle part, and he got the fiddle part so he could really play Cackling Hen very nicely. And he said, I'm going to keep playing Cackling Hen until you figure it out on the banjo. I don't read music. It was a long day. I sat there and tried to figure it out, and we finally had it figured out so I could play together. So this is from Mr. MacArthur, called, do you play Cackling Hen on a banjo? No, he's talking over there. So this is supposed to be, Mr. MacArthur's great. He'd be right in the middle of it, and there's a part where you're supposed to make a sound like chicken on a fiddle. You pull off a string, and he'd stop and say, can you hear the chicken? 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 Cackling Hen. I had that in my little arsenal of tunes. I went down to Galax and Union Grove, and boy, you go down there and you think you're really somebody special on banjo or fiddle. You go down to Galax where they have fiddlers conventions every weekend, and you run into guys like Charlie Hawkes and Otis Burris back in the 60s and Joe Green and some of these guys who go to the festivals, and boy, it really puts you back down to this perspective as to how little you are, because those guys played, I mean, they played such incredibly beautiful stuff when I was a kid. I just go there and go, ugh. And Otis Burris was the greatest fiddler at Cackling Hen I ever heard. He was just a little teeny fiddle player, and he just, you know, the rosin dust would be in a cloud over his bow. He'd be just playing Cackling Hen, and it was just great memories. In 1967, I decided to go live in Kentucky, and I went to Whitesburg and started looking for banjo tunes, and they paid me $25 a week. They said someday there's going to be a company called June Apple Records in Whitesburg, and I said, yeah, right, I've heard that one before. And I never heard anything more about June Apple Records, and then 3 years ago my wife said, let's go back down to Whitesburg, Kentucky 30 years later and see if any of these guys are still there. So 1997 we went down there. It's a big building called June Apple Records. I said, wow, they came after I left. And I was paid to go look for musicians. And what I'd do was I had a little Volkswagen Beetle. I'd park my little Volkswagen Beetle way down the bottom of a hill, and I'd take my banjo out of the case. Anytime you go up in the hills of somewhere where there's stills, leave your case in the car, because they'll shoot you. But if you have the banjo out, they'll say, come on over. And so they'd wave me up on their porches, and I'd sit there, and play music. And I met all these wonderful banjo players. And one of them was a guy named Ernest Adams, who lived on Cow Hollow Road up Pert Creek. And so I went to visit Ernest Adams, and he said, I'll play a tune my mom used to play called Red Dress Girl. And that was 1967. So 1997, I went back, and there was Ernest Adams, same house, 30 years later. And I said, you know, I still remember that tune you played for me that your mom taught to you. I never heard anybody else ever play Red Dress Girl but you. And I said, I'd like to play it for you, because he's not able to play the banjo anymore. And I said, I'll just play it for you, and I just want you to know that it's still around. It's not gone. And so I played the tune for him, and he said, well, you're doing it pretty good. He said, but don't you remember what you're supposed to do with your thumb? And I said, no. He said, give me the banjo. So I gave him the banjo. He said, that first part would go. You're supposed to be getting that second note with your thumb. You're supposed to be getting it with the back of your thumb. So no matter how good you get, you go back to Pert Creek and you're going to put it in your size. Great stuff. My sister moved to Kentucky, and I decided to go visit her. She lived there for a long time. She lived in Whitesburg, Kentucky, and worked for a guy named, what was his name? Wrote a book called Night Comes to the Cumberlands. And she lived around there for about 7 years taking photos of the strip mining, and they were published in the Whitesburg newspaper. And it was a rather dangerous job. The coal miners like to shoot people who took pictures like that. And so she finally had to leave. But I got to meet lots of really great banjo players. And one time I was going down to visit her, and I was driving my little Volkswagen, and I was really tired, and it was about, I guess, about 2 o'clock in the morning, and I'd been driving from Bloomington down to Whitesburg. And I just stopped by the side of the road, rolled my windows down, and went to sleep. And about, I guess, 5 o'clock when the sun was coming up, I could hear this god-awful noise coming toward me. I couldn't figure out what it was until I got closer, and it was one man sitting behind a mule. He had a hay cutter, what they call, I think it's called a single tree, just cuts one road at a time. And he was singing at the top of his lungs in the fog coming off this mountainside coming down toward me. And the closer he got, the more I realized, the guy could really sing. He was really singing a song called Going Around This World, Baby Mine. And so I just, woke up slowly, and I had my window down. When he got alongside, I said, can you play that on the banjo? And he said, sure. And so I got my banjo out, and he sat there and played Going Around This World, Baby Mine. The words are, going around this world, baby mine. I'm going round this world, baby mine. I'm going round this world, baby mine. I'm going round this world with a banjo picking girl. I'm going round this world, baby mine. Gonna cross that ocean, baby mine. Gonna cross that ocean, baby mine. Gonna cross that ocean if I don't change my notion. I'm gonna cross that world, baby mine. trying to get out my Ray list. Pete Steele. Talk about Pete Steele. I'm going to talk about Pete Steele. The greatest banjo player who ever played with a thumb and an index finger was probably Pete Seeger, really. He's done more than any, people laugh about Pete Seeger. Pete Seeger has done so much for the banjo, with the banjo. There will never be anybody as influential in the banjo as Pete Seeger. That's my opinion. Anyway, one of the people that Pete Seeger met back in the 40s, would be a fellow who lived in Hamilton, Ohio named Pete Steele. Your job is, if you have any idea who Andy Whitaker of when you go out of Indianapolis and go due east on Route 40, Greenfield and Knightstown, somewhere in that area was a man named Andy Whitaker, who was the guy who taught Pete Steele all the hot flash banjo tunes from Kentucky. And after Pete Steele made his recording for Folkways in 1958, 58, and then again, I guess in 1964, they did some more recording of Pete Steele. But Pete Steele always said, I can't find him anymore. The guy who taught me all his tunes was Andy Whitaker, who lived somewhere on Route 40 between Indianapolis and Knightstown, and I just can't find any address for him. I spent many, many hours, many days driving around trying to find a guy named Andy Whitaker. If any of you Hoosiers ever heard of a guy named Andy Whitaker on that stretch of road, if the family still has any tapes of that guy, there are no known remnants of any of the music that Andy Whitaker ever played. But I'm going to play you some stuff that Pete Steele learned from him, and it's just mind-boggling. Pete Steele was a Kentucky banjo player who played thumb and index style, or he played knockdown style, frailing style, and he came from East Bernstead, Kentucky, which is in the coal mining country of southeastern Kentucky. When I went to East Bernstead area down around Hazard, there are people who remembered Pete Steele and said, oh yeah, he's around here somewhere. He left in the 30s. We're talking 30 years later. He was that influential banjo player. People thought he was still around 30 years later. The sheriff of Hazard, Kentucky was a great banjo player named Justice Begley, who died in 1955. When I went looking for stories of Justice Begley, I met people who said, hey, he's still around here, I think, playing banjo. He died in 55. I was looking for him in 1980 or so. It's been, it's 1970. Anyway, Pete Steele played neat stuff, and he played all kinds of stuff. He played things like, this is a representation of, I'm going into double C tuning, which is when you're playing climber with a fiddle, you usually use this tuning because you can play in the key of D and get all kinds of little fancy little notes. This is a tune that Pete Steele used to play. He used to come to Bloomington to visit Paul Pell, who lived on the campus there in Bloomington, and Paul would call me and say, he's here. And I'd go running over. This is just a story with no words. It's about a guy who stays out too late at night. We'd never done that, have we done, Bill? And he comes back and he says, and his wife says, you gonna sing one?
No.
No.
See, you were worried about filling an hour, and here you are.
One more. Up. Well, okay. My last tune, I'm told. I have 8 minutes before 8. How about 2 tunes? I'll play you the great show tune from Pete Steele. D tuning. Pete Steele worked in the coal mines for many years, and before he came up to work for General Motors in Cincinnati. And they used to go out and put anything slippery on the train tracks going up the hills, and the train wheels would, no, I'm on the wrong tune. In Kentucky, where he lived, there were many banjo instrumental tunes that were virtuoso tunes. This is called the Coal Creek March. There were many men killed in a coal mining disaster in 1903 in an area now known as Lake City, Tennessee. And there are lots of incredible stories, but the story that seems to be true is that after bodies were brought out, somebody appeared with a banjo and played a tune. And there are many, many variations of this tune, but this is the way that Pete Steele played what he called the Coal Creek March, which is the way the man was supposed to play the banjo as he walked around the bodies of the coal miners they brought out. I need to play it faster so I can get it right. I'm not used to playing it that slow. I'm going to play one more. I use 2 fingers and a thumb. Pete Steele used 1 finger and a thumb. Same notes. I'm going back to when I was a kid. There was a wonderful man named Homer Spriggs who played the guitar and the banjo, and he was too deaf to tune his instruments. And I used to tune his instruments for him. And one time I hit open D, and he said, "I'll play the Sylvester Poole March." And I had heard of Charlie Poole, who was a banjo player, so I figured this must be some relative of Charlie Poole's. And I had it in my head, and when we moved, when I was older, to Baltimore, I had this tune in my head, and I figured it out on the banjo and the guitar. I played it for somebody, and they said, "No, this isn't the Sylvester Poole March. This is the Sevastopol Russian March." Sevastopol, whatever it is. So this is a real simple version of the Sevastopol or Sevastopol or Sevastopol Russian March. Homer Spriggs used to sit on his porch and play this by the, I was such a thorn in his side. He'd sit there and play this by the hour for me. Thank you.